Good evening. I think you can probably now hear me. But it gives me great pleasure and honour to introduce. Have I just been muted again? I'm being told I'm muted. Can you hear me? I haven't pressed anything. I can be heard. Okay, great. It keeps flashing up on my screen. I also am going to wave this wonderful book by our very own Theodora Wildcroft from SOAS, from the Centre for Yoga Studies. Although the book is a revision of her PhD thesis from the Open University, and I'm very pleased to have got a copy, wonderfully produced as well as being a wonderful book in itself. And we're going to have a discussion, a sort of round. Well, first of all, we're going to have a couple of responses to the book by two eminent luminaries of modern yoga studies. First of all, who need little introduction, but in case there's anyone here who hasn't come to any of our events before, isn't aware of these two wonderful scholars. The first is Suzanne Newcomb. So Suzanne's going to respond to the book for about 15 minutes, and Suzanne is senior lecturer in religious studies at the Open University. She's got a plethora of wonderful publications, but most significantly, or most recently, there's Yoga in Britain, which of course is highly relevant to the subject in hand this evening. I've also, I think it was just yesterday or 2 days ago, the postman struggled in with this epic tome. What's it called? The Routledge Handbook of Yoga and Meditation Studies, which we had a recent launch to. That really is fantastic, actually. I've been hugely enjoying that already. So as you can see, Suzanne's clearly well qualified to be responding to Theo's book. And we've also got, so responding to Suzanne's response, we've got Dr. Mark Singleton, who I'm sure, of course, you all also very aware of his work. I have chosen, again, he's got a huge number of publications, but I'm sure many of you are aware of this yoga body, seminal work on modern yoga in the West and in India, of course. And also he did another fantastic book of his, which he did a wonderful contribution to, slightly marred by his co-author a little bit, but basically it's another great work, Roots of Yoga. So the format is that Suzanne is going to respond to Theo's book, Post-lineage Yoga, and then Mark's going to respond to that. That should take about 20, 25, maybe half an hour, 30 minutes. And then we're going to have a roundtable discussion for about another 25 minutes or so, and then we'll be open to questions. And as Ruth noted, the questions are to be put, and I see there's already questions arriving in the Slido. Questions are to be put on the Slido in our normal Centre for Yoga Studies fashion. So I think that's everything I need to say. Thank you very much to everyone involved for contributing to this, and I look forward to a stimulating discussion. So over to you, Suzanne. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a lovely introduction, and I'm really, really pleased and honoured to be able to respond to Theo's book. And it was really exciting. Everyone's holding it up because it's such a pretty picture on the front, but I actually examined the PhD thesis quite a while ago now, and it was really exciting to see it pulled together into a monograph, and it's really tight and well argued, and I advise you all to read the book, which is an affordable paperback. And what I found really interesting, I think maybe the most interesting thing is in the first pages, in the premises that the book's based on and responding to, which are really simple but really understudied aspects of modern and contemporary yoga, and reveal some really fundamental biases in how we are able to conduct scholarship in the academy. And so these two premises that Theo starts with are, one is that practice is important and deserves to be taken seriously as a site of inquiry. And secondly, that communities themselves are production sites of knowledge. So although a lot of my work, a lot of Mark's work, a lot of all the yoga studies scholars who in this growing field, we often look at artifacts, at texts, at material culture, at the things that are produced. And obviously, when you're looking historically, there's nothing else left almost except for people's stories about and their memories about what happened in the past. But for something that's so vital, a part of many people's culture, all the huge statistics of how many people practice yoga, we've not really come to grips with how to study practice and how to study embodiment. And what I think is really exciting about Thea's work is that she really entangles herself with this problem and offers some quite innovative and interesting ways of looking at what people are doing in their bodies, as well as in space in relation to their environment, and not just what they say about what they do, because that's the default for most of us social scientists, is what are people saying they're doing, what are their stories about their meaning. We don't know what's really happening, but Theo's saying, no, we're looking at the practice. And she designs a quite interesting notation system. And although it's not kind of mulled over in detail, the observations she makes, I know, are based on really intense study of the psychosomatic embodied experiences and how these relate to the process of meaning and what people are actually doing with yoga. And so she comes up with some answers that aren't just based on what's presentable to others, how you narrate your story. And that's really, really exciting. And I look forward to talking about that more with Mark and Theo. The other really interesting thing I think she gets to grips with, that again is really underexpressed in a lot of scholarship, is this communities as productions of knowledge. And so she's got this really innovative method, more than just participant observation or field work and joining in and figuring out what's going on. She developed a method of co-practicing and shadowing her respondents. And through this, exploring the limitations of her own body and the different ways that her co-creators, in a way, of the research, her 6 case studies, how she both experiences it within her body and discusses those practices with them, comes up with some really interesting insights about the aims of practice, what's going on here when people are practicing yoga. So some of the themes that she comes up with are, what are you doing? Can you go away?
Surround me by a relax sound.
Sorry, interpersonal home working problems. My lovely daughter wanted my attention. Okay, what I was saying was the aims of the practice are both a greater alignment with an ideal, which is what you often get with more structured lineage-based practices, and what you see when you get those beautiful pictures in, say, light on yoga, is there's this external ideal, and it's not just a image of asana that people are aligning with. Sometimes these are qualities of being, like you get with, say, the Buddhist meditational practices, or an ideal of bhakti. And it's really fascinating the way Theo unravels the complex environment in which people draw and create their own personal practices. So you've got, on the one hand, this kind of alignment with an ideal, but then what's really valued in the particular subculture that she's exploring here is authentic experiences and a kind of introspective serenity, and how you respond to the emerging needs of what your body is telling you, what your body has been trained to know might be a remedy for whatever issues you want to address with your practice today. And then a kind of a period of innovation or enjoyment or expression, having applied this remedy, and then possibly a kind of settling where you savor the kind of fruits of the practice. And I thought that cycle that she articulates was really an impressive innovation, and both profoundly ordinary and profoundly creative, and really exploring what's going on with people's practices. And so she also really explores the tensions between devotion, discipline, and this idea of freedom or liberation, and how that's worked out on an individual somatic level, with her case studies and within this particular subcultural community. So there's no way I can do justice to all the really interesting insights that Theo's pulling out here, and I find listening to conversation really interesting. So I'm just going to highlight a few more things, and then we've got some kind of questions prepared that we thought would be interesting to explore together. But the two of the particularly interesting things, I think, were the way that Theo really articulates how people go through a process in their practice of this creative kind of bricolage, but really embodied what works for me, what are the things that I do. And this is one area where she was looking at a very discrete subculture in Britain, but I actually wonder how much it could be applied to other cultures of not just yoga, but this kind of spiritual but not religious practices. And again, when we study things, when we look at things, we see the glossy consumer aspect. But if we look at what people do in the privacy of their own homes, how they build their lives as a practice, I wonder if there's more insights in this subculture that are also reflective of just kind of broader human adaptation to having a body, to having to orient themselves in space, in their environment, and towards things of greater meaning, towards some kind of supernatural or just the greater natural world. So I thought that was a really exciting thing to draw from Theo's work. And another thing which I found really interesting that I think wasn't quite fully articulated in this monograph, but I wonder if there's more to be done that Theo could articulate here, which is around charisma and the production of charisma within these communities of practice, because she has got some really great insights on the tensions between how many people in this community have had a bad experience with a charismatic authority figure, and that's why they've retreated or creatively empowered themselves with a more creative, self-reflective practice in a community where they're testing out their feelings and their boundaries, their sense of authenticity in a really self-conscious way. But she also talks about how charisma is gained within this particular subculture and the tensions between creating a practice for oneself and presenting that to other people and teaching other people that, and how there's always this gap between where the practice is at and where you're teaching someone else. And probably all of us who are teaching in different ways can relate to that to some extent. But I thought that some of the concepts she uses between creating an authentic presence, an authentic place in one's practice and articulation, and how that's recognized by others in the community as well as challenged, there might be some areas there that we could theorize further to how charisma works in other areas, and also the more responsible interpersonal responses to charisma that she is also indirectly addressing in this book with the subtitle of From Guru to Me Too, and how there's a real effort to creatively readjust power imbalances, even at the same time while Theo's really creatively exploring how networks of power and kind of economics are still really relevant to the subculture, even as they're both creating something they're striving to be authentically alternative to both mainstream society and mainstream yoga as it's perceived. But it also still struggles with the same tensions of being human and needing to make a living, and needing to deal with childcare and other aspects of our lives. So I really thank Theo for her really interesting contribution to yoga studies, exploring this subcultural community of British festivals that she identified as a small a small subculture amongst the many British festival cultures, which are actually quite diverse. And I think it's got really a lot of exciting ways of furthering both yoga studies and other aspects of our understandings of social theory and what we're doing in our practices, in our maybe not yoga practices, maybe yoga practices, but everyone's practice of being alive. So over to Mark for your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. I'm gonna speak briefly. I didn't know what Suzanne was going to say, so I'm sort of responding a little bit off the cuff. But there was, you know, some of the concerns and the highlights for me of the book were what you've just been discussing. So I think I'll sort of go around some of those themes again. I've been very lucky to follow Theo's research, you know, from I think the beginning of the PhD, and to see it kind of grow and to develop into this book. I'm going to hold it up now. It arrived. So what a fantastic achievement, and I enjoyed it so much. I wrote a blurb for the back, and it seems to me that, yeah, this is a very original and important moment in yoga studies, precisely because of this, because as Suzanne was saying, you know, when the beginnings of research, academic research into modern yoga in the early 2000s with Elizabeth de Michaelis and Joseph Alter and others, and then, you know, the likes of Suzanne and myself, there has been sort of a tendency to look at these guru organizations, lineages, to look at what's particularly visible. And what Theo has done is to look at something that isn't visible. Unless you sort of know it's there, or unless you sort of have an in, you might not be aware of something that's there and that's growing, and that's extremely important for understanding yoga today, at least in Britain. I was interested actually in the I think it's in the acknowledgement where one of your supervisors characterizes the project as doing yoga in fields with hippies, and of course that sort of sent me back to, you know, that's the 60s and the development of yoga as a kind of expression of counterculture in the 60s, and this is more of a question than anything, you know, in terms of a kind of opposition to mainstream culture. It seems to me that, well, I wonder to what extent the kind of counterculture that we have here, with you know, including many people who lived through the 60s and, you know, were doing yoga in the 60s, and who are now, you know, sort of in these you know, in these different fields, or maybe the same fields. You know, like what has changed? Like what has changed about this, the kind of situating of the yogi, kind of, you know, of the yoga practitioner in a kind of counterculture. So I suppose that was one, and this is something I think that also relates to the work that Suzanne has done in yoga, on yoga in Britain, and the kind of the British wheel of yoga, let's say, on the one hand, and then the more sort of the hippie fringes on the other. I'm thinking of sort of the, you know, R.D. Laing and that sort of criticism of the medical establishment, of the psychiatric establishment, and so on. I also had questions, and I'm sure we'll get back to this in the discussion that follows, about the sort of paradox of authority within post-lineage yoga. When one gains a certain amount of authority and standing, then one's asked to teach. We read in the book. I mean, and I wonder how this sort of protects against the kinds of abuses of guru organizations, like what it is in that process that and I think I'm echoing Suzanne here, you know, like what is it in the sort of charismatic presence of these figures that does not lead to those dark places that pretty much every sort of, you know, guru-led organization that's been exported abroad has ended up in. So that's one thing. And then I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, I think, but as I read through the book and read the various accounts of personal experience of practice with the body and a kind of authenticity that's to be found in the body, I found myself trying to map the collective philosophy, if there is such a thing. And that's the thing. I mean, there's a kind of eclecticism here that that is sometimes for me was slightly bewildering when I tried to sort of map this onto sort of broader yoga cultures. There's obviously a sort of in some of the accounts, the tantric teachings are extremely important. I suppose I was wondering about, you know, assertions such as we are earth, or, you know, our body is a microbial temple, a kind of, you know, very sort of materialist, very earthy. And of course, you know, we're practicing here in the mud or, you know, we're practicing on the grass. There's a kind of elements of nature religion there, but there's also on the other hand, a kind of striving towards the pristine, towards something that's beyond the body, that's beyond the dirt, that's beyond all that. So I was wondering if that is just an expression of a kind of variety of views and a kind of eclecticism of views, or whether we can sort of formulate a metaphysics, let's say. And you've examined that in great detail, and you know, it might not be sort of reducible to that. I have other questions. I have lots of other things to say, but I think I've gone on for more than my allotted 5 minutes, and I wonder if it might be a good time to sort of turn to the broader discussion and hear Theo's voice after all this.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, great. No, we're in good time. So yeah, we've sort of discussed a few topics we might talk about, but I'm going to open the discussion by addressing a question, or I suppose it's a question directly to Theo. In that, you know, if she's identified this phenomenon of post-lineage yoga, I'm just wondering if she thinks it's a completely new phenomenon. There are similar things that I can think of that have happened in Indian tradition in the context of, well, I suppose yoga, and then more broadly, I mean, in terms of yoga, I know that there are quite a few today and in the past. There are sort of sadhus, holy men and holy women who set themselves up, who are not, you know, they don't attach themselves to a particular tradition, and that doesn't necessarily, you know, stop their popularity, but they are somewhat scorned by the other traditions. There's various term, you know, manmukhi, someone who sets themselves up, you know, just through their own inclination. So I think, you know, that phenomenon is there in India. Then also is making me think of the Sikh tradition, where they, you know, after the 10th guru deposed all the authority into the holy book, and, you know, wanted to move away from human guru traditions, and then also going even further back into the Buddhist Sangha. So I wonder if you think, I mean, perhaps you haven't even reflected on those specific instances, but whether you see this as a completely new phenomenon.
I think first of all, that's a question I get asked a lot, and I think that it's one that to an extent we have to ask ourselves as a community of yoga scholars, because I think we all have a bit of the picture, right? We all study different aspects. The global and historic distribution of yoga, the different things that are included under that umbrella, is so wide and so diverse that none of us can be experts in all of it anyway. That's the exciting question to me, having identified this phenomenon. How widespread is it, both in time and in space? For me, I think post-lineage starts out from an individual journey, that it's it is an individual teacher practitioner's crisis of faith, if you like, the moment in which someone first starts to think about that perhaps their teacher wasn't the only possible source of knowledge for them. And as I say in the book, there are many people within these communities that still have strong attachments to lineage. They're just not looking only to that as the source of knowledge. They're coming together with people from many different lineages and from none. So it's not a non-lineage movement. It is that movement into a place beyond the initial period, I think, of study, which I think is common to a lot of different traditions and a lot of different places. As you intimate, sometimes there's this place where your initial teacher is everything to you for a certain amount of time, and then beyond that point, you know, you start to look to other things, other sources of knowledge, and it's really about how we negotiate authenticity and authority when we start to do that. Basically, when the phrase "but Guruji said" is no longer enough, what do we do at that point? So I think it's more about communities moving beyond that point and individuals moving beyond that point. And it's my suspicion from speaking with, you know, with yourself, with Daniela, with Bevilacqua, with Mark, Suzanne, various other people, that actually probably there are a whole lot of grassroots communities of knowledge of this kind outside of those formal lineages. And when I speak particularly to South Asian friends or, you know, diasporic friends within yoga, quite often they will say they don't have a lineage, quote unquote. What they have is they grew up doing yoga with their aunties or with them, you know, learning pranayama from the next door neighbor or whatever. And those are exactly the kinds of processes that I'm talking about. So it may well be that your average person in India learning yoga probably learnt yoga that in what we might call a quote unquote post-lineage way within a community of knowledge rather than from one guru that they devoted themselves to. So yeah.
Yeah, if I can just respond to that before we move on to the other things, because I mean, I wonder, it's making me think that also in my experience in India, that someone will get initiated into a tradition by a guru, but then if the guru thinks that they can't teach them what they need or require, then they'll happily recommend someone else. And they, you know, and in some traditions, you know, you have 5 gurus, for example.
Yeah.
And I wonder if perhaps, I think to some extent, these traditions having been exported out of India, the notion of the guru got somewhat fetishized. What's the word? Fetishized outside of India.
Yes.
This notion that you have to do exactly what the guru says and completely abandon everything, which I haven't experienced so much in India. So maybe it's a.
So the movement, if there is one culturally, is a movement in the Anglophone world, away, like beyond modern postural yoga rather than beyond traditional yoga, if that makes sense.
Sorry,
I'll give you that again, because I think it's really fascinating, because I wonder if this is a movement that's within the Anglophone world, and it's a movement beyond the post-lineage movement is actually a movement post modern postural yoga, not post-traditional yoga. And that kind of pre-modern yoga in India, or India as it would have been done in the grassroots, is, you know, it's a kind of a return to a way of practicing, I think, rather than necessarily something new. But we see this if you look at community and liberation educational theory in many different places. We see these grassroots systems of knowledge arising over and over again in so many contexts. It's just they tend to be in indigenous contexts, in the global south, and in marginalized communities of one kind or another. So they don't necessarily get the recognition. But human beings are constantly reinventing communities of practice in one way or another, I think.
Great. Okay, so we've got a few other things to talk about. Who would anyone else?
I guess I'm next on the list of the things we wanted to make sure we talked about collectively, and I'm sure that some of you in the audience were here for Amanda Lucia's really interesting book launch last week, and we thought it would be good to kind of explore what's similar and what's different between the US-based festivals that she looks at, which are a few of a very particular kind of festival culture in America, and the kinds of festivals that Theo did her field work with. So I guess firstly, I know Amanda's in the audience as well, so if she wants to jump in, that would be fine. But yeah, so what do you think, would you say are similarities and differences, particularly in respect to the communities of practice and engagements with, say, more radical politics?
I think it's always, I mean, I spend a fair amount of my book and a certain amount of my Viva talking about radical, what radical might mean. If I remember, it's always a difficult question, and one that my supervisors kind of push me back to again and again as well. What does radical mean? And in the context of things like the counterculture, sometimes the counterculture can be very very conservative in its politics in many ways. Just because you want to be outside of mainstream does not mean you want to be living in a kind of social justice oriented world. I think yeah, it's interesting to note there are moments of radicalism that definitely arise within these particular camps. It struck me, as Mark kind of alluded to, it struck me how many people that I met within these environments had been at Greenham Common, or I mean, I literally met Gail before Extinction Rebellion was even a thing, doing workshops. Gail Bradbrook, who co-founded Extinction Rebellion, she was doing workshops at the camp that I was going to, that I was at, and then there's things like the Calais Jungle and so on and so forth. So they are kind of a seedbed almost for these kind of other more radical moments to arise from, but they don't necessarily mobilize the camps as a whole. The events as a whole are just doing their thing, coming together, being communities practicing. So it's very possible to be in those spaces and not be any of those things. I think there's also a different kind of radicalism that's happening now, in that we are seeing within a number of these communities a huge rise in conspiracy theory narratives now, and we can talk about that more, and that's a real problem. How do we deal with that? But I think specifically when it comes to racial politics, Amanda's work is all about whiteness and what whiteness looks like. The picture is mixed. I think there are more yoga teachers within the UK scene generally that spend time in India, or who have significant personal connections to India of one kind or another, and to South Asian communities. We're also seeing, I think, more and more South Asian women in particular in these communities taking positions of leadership in different ways, but it's small, and it's by no means a solved problem. We're still working within the context of colonialism. We're still working within the context of kind of rising racism within the UK more generally, I think.
I've got two follow-up questions. I don't know if, and then if Amanda wants to jump in, or if she wants to be quiet. But one thing I liked your phrase of, there seems to be something about being good enough in your social justice lifestyle in this community. And I kind of wondered if you could say a bit more about that, and if that was a difference. As well as, one of the things I found really interesting about Amanda's work was the way there were particular markers for in-group and out-groups, which weren't necessarily to do with race, but you had to join in the project and then you'd be accepted. And you talk a little bit of that in terms of, like, are you willing to clean toilets or do the cooking? But to what extent are there those really strong, like, okay, you belong here and you definitely don't, things going on?
Well, let's answer that one first. I think, I think that they're different in different places, but what it was really resonant of for me, it was not about yoga teachers at all. It was about festival cultures. So I've spent time in different kind of countercultural and festival spaces, lots of small camps of different kinds, pagan camps, you know, eco camps, you know, those kinds of things. And though that kind of gatekeeping is common to all of those spaces, it's when we know that you're a person who can be trusted. It's when we know that you're a person who is vaguely practical. It's you know, rather than kind of being obsessed with your presentation as a teacher or whatever, that's what really counts in a lot of these spaces. I tend to go to a lot of events with my husband, and I tend to say that he's always more welcome at events than I am, because he is very practical. He has a number of practical skills, and people with practical skills are much more highly valued. So I like the fact that these are the spaces of my research, and you know, I'm the person who brings them in theory to the world's attention. But I rock up and everyone wants to know where Phil is. You know, they want to know where he is. And he doesn't teach yoga. He's not. He doesn't do any of that stuff. But he, you know, he can run a PA. You know, and he can hold a hammer sensibly. So there's a lot of that sense of these are spaces that we're building together. These are communities these are kind of that. You know, these ideas of temporary autonomous zones that we're building together, and therefore they have to function. You know, the toilets don't exist until we get there. The showers don't exist until we get there. So therefore, as a community, we have to build them, and that does privilege a different set of skills as a result, I think, and therefore a different kind of status, which is very different if that status is based on how many followers you have on Instagram or how many people you can pull into the event, because that's what makes money. And that, I think, is the related thing, is that most of these events work very much on volunteer labor rather than economic income. So as a result, they privilege different things for that reason. You know, if you're putting an event on and it's costing you $100,000 to put it on, you need to know that the people headlining in that event are going to pull in a serious amount of people with a serious amount of money in their pockets. That's just practicalities rather than anything else. What was your first question again?
Well, it was saying a bit more about being a good enough social justice warrior, sort of.
Yeah. I think you know, perfectionism in general is much less evident within not just the UK scene. I think within the European scene in many ways. I think there's something that is not exclusively, but it is particularly US American at that, where you know, everyone's the shiniest possible version of themselves and presenting that shiniest possible version of themselves, and you get that reflected back at you as well. So on one or two rare occasions where I have taught or lectured in the States, you know, everything's always amazing. Everything you do for them is always amazing. Everything's wonderful. Everything's just the most amazing thing ever. And it slightly weirds me out as a British person. I just want to do a good enough job that people would quite like to invite me back. So I think there's a kind of self-deprecating kind of pragmatism culturally, which does change things as a result, and that takes some of the pressure off of yoga teachers as contemporary yoga teachers, as self-employed people, in many ways working from self-presentation, from, you know, the kind of the resources of the self. You know, you need to come to terms with being good enough, because otherwise you'll burn out, I think, trying to be the best yoga teacher each and every day. No, I don't know if you find that in because you know you've done a lot more work on the history of yoga in Britain than I have, and I wonder how much that kind of pragmatism rather than perfectionism.
Oh, I think it's definitely a pragmatic thing going on rather than a being the best. And also, I mean, the phrase "good enough," of course, comes from Winnicott and being a good enough mum, which is also a very British thing as well.
Yes.
I can't actually see if Amanda wants to say anything or not. Can you?
We could just unmute her and
see
put her
if
on the
she
spot.
says anything.
I'm going to unmute her.
Yeah, I couldn't say because I was muted, but I just am loving the discussion. I do think that I want to just say one thing that I think Theo's completely right, that it depends on the festival, right? Where it's this more kind of upstart, everyone's pulling it together, we build the toilets when we get there, is very different from like a high production value space where you're trying to sell tickets. So yeah, I would say that that's probably the main difference in the different kinds of festival, different kinds of yoga, different kinds of democratic ethos that you see. But besides that, I'm loving it, and I have dogs barking, so I'm going to go back to muted. So cheers.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so should we move on to the next question then? Thanks for that. I think that was, is it Mark asking the next one?
Yeah, that's right. So we're seeing more studies that are like Theo's, that are looking actually at the lived experience of practitioners, right, rather than what texts say, or sort of archival historical research. The experience of spiritual practices in yoga studies. And one of the things, as we've said, that's most striking about Theo's book is the methodology, and the notation system for movement, and the kind of borrowing from different disciplines to undertake the study. So I was wondering what kinds of innovation we're seeing now in yoga studies that seem to be most promising or most exciting. What kind of combinations of method or approach are gonna sort of bring shed new light on yoga? And I think just to mention a few just that I've been involved with in one way or another, like Matilda Chokosh's studies of the Krishnamacharya lineage, based, sort of studying the relationship between the metaphors in the writings of teachers like Iyengar and the way they do their yoga, say, or the kind of embodied philology that we've done a bit of in the Hatha Yoga project, combining sort of bodily movement that Ruth also was very much involved in there, sort of textual and physical practices, things that we haven't really seen in the study of modern yoga before. So it's just sort of an open question, maybe for Theo first, like what do you see as the most exciting developments or ways forward, or things that are happening now that weren't happening 5 years ago?
And I think that I think they were really interesting examples you pulled out, because those are the kinds of things that are really exciting me as well, is where we're actually getting to grips with a kind of almost an experimental anthropology, or experimental kind of way of working, where we really explore practices in different ways. I mean, my notation was really obviously influenced by Banesh and Laban and the kind of dance studies and those kinds of things, but it also needed to move beyond that because of my understanding of how the practices of yoga worked. So there is that sense of, how is the body of the researcher and the materiality of the research space embedded in the research, and what does it have to say? And as well as those two examples, we've got Matilda coming to speak next year, which would be lovely, and I'm really looking forward to that, because I think that is good work as well. I'm also aware within the yoga project, there's kind of, Dagmar has posted these most amazing kind of recreations of kind of alchemical kind of recipes on Facebook and places like that. And I think that it's sometimes easy to see those as almost like the fluff on top of the research. This is the cute thing we got to do, kind of like, this is what I did on my holidays and the cute bits of the research. But I think we need to start putting these at the heart of what we do and figuring out how we capture the data. Like, how do you actually capture the data? Because if you can capture it, then you can analyze it. Until the thing about the notation system for me that wasn't a process that I put together in order to show the data. That was my process of trying to capture the data in the first place. And until I had figured out a way of doing that, I couldn't compare it. I couldn't really seriously start talking about what the relationship was between intention and form until I could really compare those things side by side, moment by moment in the practice. And that's when some really interesting insights started to come out. But yeah, Suzanne, I think, on this one.
I kind of said what I was found most exciting, but I think really looking at practice and articulating what are people doing with their practices, with their bodies, with their lives, not just what they say about what they're doing, which is like the easy way out, but what are they actually doing? And I think that you point towards some really interesting psychosomatic ways of that our bodies and our connections with other people affect us in a really deep way, and where you point towards how the creation of meaning systems is also part of an entrainment of our psychosomatic systems. If we breathe together, if we do together, this is creating meaning. And I think that understanding how we're doing that both in yoga communities, because we're obviously trying to yoga communities are trying to do something there self-consciously to some extent, but also just how we're doing that in our daily lives and the problems that is causing us by not doing it more consciously. I think those are really exciting areas that we might get to.
I think I would say it's hard as a researcher because you have to become, you have to dive in. Interdisciplinarity is obviously still a big buzzword within academic circles, but doing it well is really hard. Having to read, I mean, I didn't do a huge amount, but reading even just the amount of neuroscience and understanding of kind of theories of consciousness that I had to do, I had to do a fair amount of lying down and trying to figure it out. That's hard reading that stuff as someone who's not an expert in those kinds of things. So yeah, I also think it's about how we're able to have conversations between us about these things, because then we don't all have to be experts in everything. And I think I know that it was something that was in many ways difficult about the Routledge book, was how do we bring some of those neuroscientific insights, for example, and the kind of biological insights, scientific insights into yoga, how do we bring those into conversation with some of this other stuff? And some people are doing that really well. I mean, I always point to kind of Willoughby Britton's work, I think, in Buddhism is brilliant for a really nuanced kind of project that works right on the edge between practitioner knowledge, a kind of deep anthropology of practitioner knowledge, deep ethnography of that, and a scientific kind of ordering of that information into a codified system that we can understand, I think. But yeah, it's tricky.
Fantastic, thank you very much.
So I think I'm on for the next question again, which is one of the things that Theo talks about in her book from time to time is this tension between standards and safety and the kind of oppression of doing a practice that might have been right for someone else's body at one point in time, but not for yours right now. And so we wanted to kind of draw out what about the rise of trauma-informed yoga, the idea of safe spaces, and the kind of tensions between safety and structure, or safety and structure. In another point in your book, you contrast intuition and discipline, and how you draw upon embodied disciplines to create the structure for more gentle, freeing, intuitive processes. So can you talk a bit more, I think, Theo, in the first instance, and maybe Mark has also something to add, about this tension between standardization, creating safety, and also kind of emerging models of consent, and those issues that are so alive both within the yoga world and outside the yoga world?
Yeah, I think I also need to mention Amelia Wood here, who I know is on the call, in terms of people who are really starting to try and grapple with issues of abuse and safety, because that's, I think that's in some ways is the elephant in the room of modern yoga and contemporary yoga. And you were talking earlier about charisma within post-lineage networks and whether that guards against abuse. I don't think it necessarily guards against abuse. I think it guards against the kind of abuse that involves hundreds of thousands of people and massive systems. The power that is accrued to an individual when a large lineage is associated with them is of a different level than somebody who has 20, 30 students or a handful of apprentices that are working with them. Does it mean that there's no interpersonal conflict? Does it mean that there's no abusive tendencies? And no, I think it's I think those patterns are still there, and how we start to really navigate such things as consent in many ways is a question I don't know how to answer on a personal and professional level, even as a yoga teacher myself, how we deal with that and how we work within these spaces. I'm increasingly wary of the term trauma-informed because it seems to be looking in many cases for another form of standardization. A lot of folk trauma-informed trainings will actually teach you yet again one more single way of doing things that's supposed to be applicable to all people at all times. So yeah, I don't think safety is found within protocols, and I don't think safety is found within regulation. I think safety is found within accountability, and I think the biggest question that the yoga teaching industry and the yoga teaching communities will have to face in the next 5 to 10 years is, what does accountability really look like? What does it mean to be accountable? And to my knowledge, all of the yoga teaching bureaucracies that I know about, for example, all have really good standards and practices in theory, but none of them have robust processes of accountability in place. So what actually happens when somebody breaks those rules? That's a lot less clear. So how are we going to hold each other accountable and hold ourselves accountable? It is a really difficult question, I think. It certainly doesn't look like everyone following the same curriculum, I don't think. I don't know.
Okay, thanks for that, Thea. So
I was just wondering if Suzanne had anything to say on it, because I know Inform, I was on the Inform call around spiritual abuse, and I was wondering if there was anything coming out of that work that was making sense yet.
I don't know that we have any conclusions yet. Amanda's working on it as well.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting area that I think everyone's grappling with, and I think the as a culture trying to both hold people into account and not throw useful babies out with the bathwater, that might grow into something that is still beautiful and meaningful. I think that's really what we're struggling with, and I think that the communities of communication and dialogue, some of which there's good practice of that you describe in these particular sub-communities, but also the process of listening to your own body and becoming more aware of consent being an ongoing conversation as a culture. It's not something you can just sign on the dotted line and that's it. But I don't know if Mark wants to, if you want to move on, because we've got some good questions in the Slido.
Sure,
shall we move on to your question, Mark?
Okay. So skipping, yeah, sure.
Yes.
Well, okay, just as a sort of last question, it's a bit unformed. So Theo draws on Bruno Latour's work to talk about this modern human world, and in the book there's sort of statements such as that the human practitioner is more than human. So it's back again, I think, to this this problem, possible problem, or my confusion maybe about the sort of the assertion that we are Earth, a real sort of strong sort of nature religion, and you know, sort of, I'm calling it sort of, you know, nature religion, with what I see as, well, I'm thinking here about Donna Haraway, and we've talked about this before, and the sort of, you know, the cyborg, and the you know, the more than human in relation to other species, in relation to nature, that we're, you know, we're not quite, we're never quite human. And I'm wondering how that possibly relates in also to technology. So there's a kind of, there's a rejection of technology, right? We don't like phones, and this is, this, you know, you know, we're not going there, but we are going there, and we're moving sort of beyond the human in that way, but we're not going to move beyond the human in that way. So I'm just wondering if there's something sort of interesting there to talk about in that.
I do, and yeah, and I want to talk about it in a way that allows you to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing, because that's why I think we put this question in, partly is because, you know, what's the link between the more than human and the transhuman in terms of ideas of being with the world compared to ideas of transcending the world, and I think that there is a tension, regardless of what. And again, it's about what actually happens rather than the narratives. The narratives within these spaces are all about being, you know, being with nature and so on and so forth. But to what extent is any practice taking us essentially outside of the world, transcending or embodying, and whether we can even be fully aware of that ourselves? Like, how much, to what extent are we fooling ourselves in the processes of becoming with the world? I think is another question. I'm very fond of Haraway's later work, actually, which is interestingly in response to the transhumanist kind of, or the post-humanist agenda, which is around the idea of companion animals and being with, which is why it's obviously completely the right moment for the dog to have woken up and moved, because I'm not actually allowed to be in a different room from my companion animal, otherwise he gets very upset. So, you know, this idea that Haraway has of companion species of different kinds, and she does use dogs as an example, as being beings that almost force us to be in a process of becoming with, or to recognize the fact that we are always becoming with the world. We are not separate from it, and we cannot be separate from it. And, you know, having a companion animal is a constant reminder of that fact. And I guess I'm really interested to see what's coming out of your work with the post-humanist side of things, and also how old this tension might be within the history of yoga between the transcending and the becoming with, right?
Right, exactly.
It's fundamental.
Well, I won't talk about, you know, what I'm doing, but I mean, it seems to me, you know, very there is the kind of up and out model of transhumanism, where, you know, you're uploading, you know, the sort of singularity idea, does it seem to me is very, very far away from the kind of the kind of experience you're describing there, and what we see here. Yeah, I mean, it's also obviously, it seems to me that the sort of the anti-technological sort of statements that we see in the book are also linked to the, you know, the deep suspicion of neoliberalism, and a kind of dehumanizing that goes on there, rather than a transhumanizing or something like that. So all of this is at play. But I look forward to talking more with you about that in the future. And maybe now's the time then to open up for questions, is it, Jim?
Yeah, I think so. But bang on time. It's exactly 8 o'clock, so it's perfect. Thank you. We've got 15 minutes for questions, and we've got a few in the Slido. At the top of the moment, we've got Matteo Di Placido, our regular contributor, who's got a couple of pointed questions. So if we can go to him, that would be great, and he can ask them. If not, I'll read them out.
We've got Matteo.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Matteo.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the beautiful presentation and the nice comments and questions from everybody. So let me read on the webpage what I wrote. I have a couple of questions for you. One is related to something we were saying last week with Amanda about white possessivism, and I was wondering if post-lineage yoga contribute in some way to the decolonization of yoga, or if instead is another expression of white possessivism. And this would be the first question. And the other one I have is if your methodology of co-practicing and shadowing differ or if overlaps instead with, for instance, Pink's multisensory ethnography or Vacant's observant participation.
Sure.
And that would be it.
Brilliant. Fantastic questions as ever, Matteo. So the first one, to what extent is this kind of a decolonization or a form of white possessiveness? I think the easier answer is that it depends. It is possible to do both and be working in a post-lineage way. I think to a certain extent, at least within post-lineage environments, there is a lack of possessiveness more generally. The lack of universal narratives, the lack of there's one way to do things, means that it's very hard for anyone to own post-lineage yoga for that purpose. And I'm seeing just in the last couple of years, actually since I did the field work, I'm seeing parts of that subculture and some of my respondents directly trying to start to answer that question. How can we decolonize yoga spaces? And in some ways that was and one of the many tiny tragedies of the kind of COVID 2020 was that because we've had no events this year, the community hasn't come together, and at least at Santosha, and I think in a number of other places as well, what was on the schedule for this year was to start to kind of have those conversations at the very least within these spaces and start to talk about what decolonization might mean in the context of yoga and with the context of these spaces. But that's not to say that that is a universal change, because there's nothing universal within such a diverse field, if that makes sense. But to come to your other question, yes, I mean my methodology is very much steeped in the traditions and the kinds of methodologies you already referred to. I think the element that I do draw on that is not mentioned in your examples is the work of Tausig and other people around empathy and mimesis. So it's not, co-practice is not just being in the same space as, it's not just joining in with, it is a moment in time as a site of knowledge in which one person moves and the other follows. So it's much more akin to kind of some of the experimentations you get in dance situations, what it means for two bodies to do that. And everyone, I mean, literally every one of my respondents within those case studies talked about the unexpected intimacy of that process. And it changed not just the practice, so it changed not just that data, it also changed the conversations we were able to have afterwards. And I'm still figuring out what it means to do that, co-practice methodology specifically. And of course, that has many, many implications for how we understand the very fact that what characterizes modern yoga, as much as anything else, is people doing yoga in groups. That is much less known in the pre-modern era. It's not, obviously by no means unique, but this standard model of a great class, what does it actually mean for a group of people to be side by side, moving together, breathing together? So it had implications for my analysis as well, I think. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And, if I can just briefly,
Sure.
I think this has massive implications for the way for what you wrote about, the data that came out of your research, because basically you constructed this data dancing together with the participants.
Well, I constructed one half of the data. Participant observation was the other half of the data, which is why the book falls out the case studies specifically. Yeah. Yeah, I did the traditional stuff first. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Matteo. The next question is from Liliana Benitez. So if we could go to her, that'd be great.
Hi, Theo, and thanks for the presentation. I'm a bit confused about the main research questions that you posed in your thesis. So if you can help us to understand those better, and what were the results and what were the gaps.
Okay, so I think the boundaries of the research are more about the research target than the research question. So I'm going to just mention that briefly first. The target of the research was to understand the processes involved in one coherent community, one coherent subculture. So I didn't set out to describe something that was in any way global. I set out to discover what was happening in this one specific environment. The implications of that for other environments became clearer and clearer and clearer as the research went on. But the questions I set out to ask around these particular communities were kind of multiple. The first one was, why is this invisible? Why is it that the academic and the mainstream media representations of yoga, of contemporary yoga in particular, are so different from the yoga that I'm seeing in these spaces? So why are they invisible? How are they invisible? And then secondly, diving into it, was what are the motivations? What are the motivations for the peoples in these spaces? What are they actually trying to do? And specifically, how are they negotiating authority and authenticity? Those were the big questions of the research within those spaces. Yeah. And when I formed a model for that, the model for that started to have applicability beyond the research space itself in many other spaces. If that helps.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we have as a name I recognize, Leslie Kaminoff. So if we can get to him, please.
Hello, Leslie.
Hey, Theo. Let me turn my camera on.
How you doing?
Hey there. Good to see you.
Thank you.
So, yes, how did I phrase my question? Let me see. Between the time you completed the book and today, like if you were completing the book today, are there any current events or fresh insights you would have wished you would have been able to include in it?
That is a good question. I think that there are kind of obvious answers in respect to having attempting to understand how widespread these processes are beyond the spaces of my research. But I can't in all conscience say that I could prove those things. I know about them because I come up with a model and lots of yoga teachers around the world said, but this looks familiar to me. So I think we included a certain amount of that. It would be nice to do more research into that. I think that my understanding, the things that I have become aware of since that are most interesting to me, one of which is a real understanding of how important being together is, given the year that we've all had and how rarely yoga teachers have been able to be together, and what it means to be together online rather than in person, and those kinds of, what those different mediums or media of being together, the impact that they have on our abilities to be together, the ways in which, for example, social media filters or distorts the ways that we're able to be together so that it doesn't feel like a community in the same way. So those are kind of interesting questions, I think, to start to look at. I think more, as Suzanne was saying, on charisma in these spaces, are interesting questions to be asking. And I think one of the places that I'm really starting to be tentatively think things through is around neurodiversity, because a lot of what we're talking about is about neurological processes of being together. And it is my suspicion that a lot of the yoga teachers in these spaces are neurodiverse in some way. And I would really like to understand the impact of that neurodiversity on the ways in which we come together, our need for being together, what happens when we come together. And I think that'd be a really exciting link to make, basically.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Next on the list is a huge question that you can answer with one word, I imagine. Do you address the issue of cultural appropriation?
Briefly. Briefly. I mean, to a certain extent, I can only, when it comes to those kinds of questions, I can only report the things that my respondents are talking about within those spaces. Are these issues that my respondents are thinking about and talking about? And I think they are. I don't think it is my place as an ethnographer to pronounce on you know, whether on what cultural appropriation looks like. I would rather always defer to scholars with more background in those studies. So I do include insights from those scholars. I think that you know, there are lots of people doing good work in that area, and I'm not going to name them on the basis that I will forget somebody really important. There are some really, really good scholars looking at that work. So in brief, I touch on it, I explain why it's not my central area of concern, and I try and amplify the voices of people who are doing that work, if that helps.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
thanks. And so the next one is another anonymous one.
Mm.
It's also a big question that, anyway, you can, well,
Oh, I like that.
I'll run it past you. Is authenticity found in the physical practice or in academic institutions?
It's not my job to answer that question. It is not the job of an ethnographer to pronounce on what is and isn't authentic. All I can say is how the communities that I research think about authenticity and how they would answer that question. And I think they would answer that question. I think my respondents would overwhelmingly say it's about the practice. You know, I think the job of academic institutions is not to make those pronouncements, it's to shine a light on things and give lenses and ways of understanding things that help people make sense of what they do better.
Okay, thanks. We've got two more. I don't know if we'll have time, because with the first one, I'm being fair, doing it in the order that it was put in.
Sure.
But, as an anonymous one, can
Yeah.
you give an outline of audiences and communities you spoke to and how you first defined and approached these groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've kind of answered that question already, in that I was looking at a very specific community that seemed to be doing something that was very normal for them and very unusual with reference to yoga as it is portrayed, both in academia and within mainstream media. It was a community I already knew, and it was the existence of it that I found fascinating. And I set out, you know, I think Mark pulled up the description. I'm going to name him. It's Graham Harvey who said that my research was about hippies doing yoga in fields, and that's how he talks about it. And it's in the process of understanding that community that the model came about. And then, as we've said, that model then starts to become of interest for understanding other communities. How did I approach them? I hung out. I did a lot of Seva and a lot of Bhakti, and I really love it. Actually, what I would say, because I owe a debt to Graham for this, Graham in his work, he does a lot of work looking at indigenous practices of religion, and he has this concept of methodological guesthood. That your method, your stance as a researcher is one of a guest. You're not a member of the group, but neither are you a stranger. You have rights and you have responsibilities. And he talks about that at some length. And on the basis of that, I think that my position within the community is one of a methodological saver, that I am in service to that community and in service to the production of academic knowledge. And I attempt to balance those two obligations.
Okay, great. We got one, and it's one of our own. So and it might be a very quick answer. It might not be. But if we could go to Lucy May Constantini, we're a minute over, but that's. I think we've got time for it. And
Go on, ask me the difficult question, Lucy. Hi.
Hey there, Theo. Thank you
Hello,
very much.
lovely.
Thank you all for a very, yeah, lovely discussion there. So my question was about the notation system, and I was wondering if it's been peer reviewed by other movement notation experts, and if so, what their thoughts are, because that seems to me an interesting discussion.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting discussion to be had. The short answer is no, and the reason for that is twofold. First of all, when I was putting the thesis together, there was an actual and very real concern that if I waved the notation system around too much, that it would be academically stolen and published on my, before I could publish it. So I didn't wave it around too widely. I did wave it around with a lot of people within the EU I could trust. And of course it was based on a lot of the kinds of work that you're talking about. The second answer is that one of my outstanding jobs that I would love to do is to produce specifically a peer-reviewed article on the methodology, and use that as the start of a conversation. But you know, COVID. But I would love to start having that conversation, and I know I've waved it at you, and I would love you to, you know, help me wave it at lots of people, and because I think it will only become useful through that process, really.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, that brings us to the end. We're a couple of minutes over, but we'll wrap it up now. I think just remains for me to once again congratulate Theo.
Thank you.
Great achievement, great moment. And as I said, it's really, I'm jealous of how beautifully produced the book is as well. And it's quite cheap, isn't it?
Yeah. Equinox generally, yeah. And I also should mention that that's also down to Leticia Valverdes, who basically gave me a hard drive of photos and said, you can have any you like. So that's why the cover's so beautiful.
And it's available at post-lineage.yoga, and you can go to if you use the code, it's all been put in the chat actually, EQX, to get 25% off. So with that, it just remains for us, congratulations, Theo, and for us all to say, well, I'm going to say thank you to everyone on the panel who's contributed, not just Theo, but also Mark Singleton and Suzanne, of course, and Ruth as well for introducing, and thank you for all the excellent questions as well.